In 2021, the FBI traced over 700 bank accounts across the United States back to a single criminal network. The accounts belonged to medical imaging companies, trading firms, and other businesses that appeared legitimate on paper. Investigators discovered that the people running these operations shared a peculiar trait. They all used aliases based on African liberation leaders. One called himself Nelson Mandela. Another went by Patrice Lumumba. A third used the name Marcus Garvey. These weren't random choices. They were part of a naming system used by a brotherhood that started as a student group at a Nigerian university in 1977. That brotherhood, called the Black Axe, had spent decades evolving from a campus organization into a transnational criminal syndicate. By the time American authorities understood what they were dealing with, the group had already embedded itself within diaspora communities in Texas, New Jersey, and other states, using a combination of ritualistic loyalty, business fronts, and sophisticated fraud schemes to move tens of millions of dollars. The question investigators faced wasn't just how to dismantle the American operations. It was how a university confraternity had transformed into a global mafia in the first place. The Neo-Black Movement of Africa was founded on July 7, 1977, by 9 students at the University of Benin in Nigeria. The founder, Nicholas Idmudia, framed the organization around Pan-Africanist ideals and what members called intellectual radicalism. The stated mission was the liberation of the black race from colonial vestiges. Campus confraternities in Nigeria during this period operated as social brotherhoods, offering protection, networking, and a sense of identity for students navigating institutional hierarchies. The Neo-Black movement positioned itself as distinct from other groups by emphasizing intellectual engagement alongside traditional rituals. Members adopted symbols that reflected their ideology, an axe to represent the severing of colonial chains, and the colors black, white, and yellow to signify African identity, purity, and wealth. The axe became the defining emblem, eventually giving the group its common name, Black Axe. The founding occurred during a period of significant political upheaval in Nigeria. The country had experienced multiple military coups, and universities had become sites of resistance against authoritarian governance. Students organized protests, boycotts, and demonstrations demanding democratic reforms and better educational conditions. The Neo-Black movement emerged within this context as part of a broader student activism movement. However, unlike purely political organizations, it incorporated elements of traditional African secret societies, including ritualistic practices meant to bond members and establish hierarchy. This combination of modern political activism and traditional cultural practices gave the organization a unique character that set it apart from other student groups. Throughout the 1980s, the organization expanded across Nigerian universities. It incorporated rituals influenced by juju practices, which added a layer of spiritual significance to membership. The group described these rituals as manhood tests meant to bond members and ensure loyalty. Students viewed the rituals as a means of connecting with traditional African culture while resisting Western influence. The movement gained prominence during a period of political instability in Nigeria, when military regimes frequently clashed with student activists. Members used kerosene-soaked napkins to repel tear gas during protests, framing themselves as freedom fighters resisting government repression. This narrative of resistance helped the organization attract recruits who identified with its anti-establishment rhetoric. The expansion across campuses followed a deliberate pattern. Senior members would graduate and move to new universities for postgraduate studies or employment, establishing chapters at their new institutions. These chapters maintained communication with the original Benin city base, but operated with significant autonomy in managing local affairs. The decentralized structure allowed the organization to spread rapidly while adapting to the specific conditions of each campus. By the mid-1980s, the Neo-Black movement had established a presence at virtually every major university in southern Nigeria, with membership numbering in the thousands. However, the group's growth coincided with increasing violence on Nigerian campuses. Confraternities began to clash with each other over territorial control and influence. The Black Axe became known for its willingness to use force against rival groups and individuals who opposed its activities. What began as occasional fistfights at parties or over romantic rivalries escalated into organized attacks involving weapons. Members armed themselves with machetes, clubs, and eventually firearms. The violence served multiple purposes. It established dominance over rival groups, enforced discipline within the organization, and created a reputation that facilitated recruitment by convincing students they needed protection. In 1994, the Black Axe officially separated from the Neo-Black movement as a militant subgroup, though the two organizations remained closely linked in practice. The separation was partly administrative, responding to government pressure on the Neo-Black movement to denounce violence, and partly tactical, allowing the most militant members to operate without implicating the broader organization. Graduating members attempted to move operations away from universities due to the escalating danger, but the culture of violence continued. The transition from campus to broader society introduced new criminal opportunities. Members who had used violence to control campus social life began applying the same tactics to business disputes, political competitions, and territorial control in urban areas. On July 10, 1999, Black Axe members killed 5 students at Obafemi Awolowo University in what became known as the Obafemi Awolowo University Massacre. The incident occurred during a factional dispute within the university's confraternity landscape. Black Axe members attacked a hostel where rival group members were residing, using firearms and machetes. The brutality of the attack shocked the Nigerian public and drew national attention to the cult violence problem. The massacre marked a turning point, signaling the group's shift from a student brotherhood into a violent criminal organization willing to commit mass murder to maintain dominance. The Black Axe operates through a rigid hierarchical structure designed to ensure operational continuity even if individual leaders are arrested or killed. The organization uses a pyramidal model, with autonomous zones operating in different regions but sharing a common code and ritual framework. At the top of each zone sits the chairman, an elected officer responsible for strategic planning and executive oversight. The chairman is typically elected by senior members of the zone during a formal meeting, often held during one of the organization's gyration events. Elections can be contested, with candidates presenting their qualifications and vision for the zone's development. However, the election process is heavily influenced by seniority, contributions to the organization, and connections to powerful members. Above the zonal level, a National Council of Elders in Benin City, Nigeria, presides over the global organization, setting policy and mediating disputes between zones. The council consists of founding members and long-serving senior figures who have demonstrated exceptional loyalty and capability. The council meets periodically to address major issues affecting the organization, including conflicts between zones, responses to law enforcement pressure, and strategic decisions about expansion into new territories. The council's authority is derived partly from its control over the organization's spiritual and ritualistic elements. The original membership scrolls, signed in blood during initiations, are maintained in Benin City, creating a symbolic connection between all members worldwide and the organization's founding. Within each zone, specific roles are assigned based on function. The priest holds spiritual authority, presiding over initiation ceremonies known as blending or bamming and administering oaths of secrecy. The priest is responsible for maintaining the ritualistic purity of the organization, ensuring that ceremonies are conducted according to established protocols. The position requires extensive knowledge of the organization's history, symbols, and spiritual practices. Many priests are older members who have been with the organization for decades and who command significant respect. The priest also serves as a counselor and dispute mediator, using his spiritual authority to resolve conflicts between members without resorting to violence. The Oga is the term used for the boss of a zone operating in a foreign location, such as the United States or Europe. The Oga holds ultimate authority within his zone, making decisions about recruitment, operations, and resource allocation. The position carries significant prestige and financial benefits, as the Oga typically receives a percentage of all money generated by the zone's criminal activities. The Oga also serves as the primary liaison with other zones and with the National Council in Nigeria, communicating major developments and seeking guidance on strategic matters. The selection of an Oga is a critical decision for the organization, as the wrong choice can lead to law enforcement penetration or internal conflicts that weaken the zone. Below these leadership positions, members are assigned operational roles. Butchers handle enforcement, including physical punishment of defectors and fighting rival groups. The butcher role is considered one of the most prestigious within the organization's operational hierarchy, as it demonstrates willingness to use violence on behalf of the Brotherhood. Butchers are typically younger members who are physically capable and who have proven their loyalty through successful completion of violent tasks. They serve as the organization's muscle, intimidating rivals, punishing rule breakers, and protecting members from external threats. In the diaspora, butchers also serve as enforcers for the organization's fraud schemes, threatening victims who refuse to pay or money mules who attempt to keep funds for themselves. Eyes serve as intelligence officers, monitoring police activity and rival movements. The Eyes are responsible for gathering information about law enforcement investigations, identifying potential informants, and tracking the activities of rival organizations. They maintain networks of informants within communities, sometimes paying for information and sometimes using threats to compel cooperation. Eyes attend public meetings, monitor social media, and cultivate relationships with individuals who have access to useful information. The intelligence gathered by eyes is reported to the OGA and used to make tactical decisions about when to conduct operations, when to lay low, and when to relocate activities to avoid detection. Criers manage publicity and recruitment, distributing flyers and electronic messages to attract new members. The criers serve as the organization's marketing arm, crafting messages that appeal to potential recruits while obscuring the criminal nature of the organization. They create social media content portraying the Black Axe as a legitimate cultural organization focused on Pan-Africanism and community development. They organize public events, including cultural festivals and charity drives, that provide opportunities to identify and approach potential recruits. Criers also manage the organization's response to negative publicity, creating counter-narratives when media coverage threatens recruitment or when law enforcement actions require public explanation. The role of the butcher is particularly significant in maintaining internal discipline. Members in this position pride themselves on their willingness to instigate violence, which the organization considers its official policy for dealing with anti-cultists or individuals who oppose the group. In the United States and Europe, butchers have been linked to extortion, threats of physical harm, and violent enforcement of the group's code. The mere presence of known butchers within a community serves as a deterrent to cooperation with law enforcement, as community members understand the consequences of being labeled an anti-cultist. The hierarchical system ensures that no single arrest can collapse an entire zone. If a chairman is detained, the OGA or another high-ranking member assumes control. If an OGA is extradited, the zone restructures around remaining leaders. This decentralized model allows the organization to absorb law enforcement pressure without losing operational capacity. Members are often dual-status individuals who maintain legitimate employment or business ownership while fulfilling roles within their local zone. This dual identity is not incidental but strategic. The organization explicitly instructs members to establish legal businesses as cover for illicit activities. A message disseminated to the membership stated that even if a member engages in illicit business fraud, they must have another source of income by registering a business venture. These businesses serve as the physical and legal instruments used to move stolen money through the financial system. The dual-status approach provides multiple benefits. It creates cover stories for travel and expenditures, it provides legal income that can be reported to tax authorities, and it establishes legitimate business relationships that can be exploited for criminal purposes. The result is a criminal organization that operates openly within legitimate economic structures, making detection and prosecution significantly more difficult. A member might spend his days managing a medical imaging business, attending professional conferences, and building relationships with other healthcare providers, while spending his evenings coordinating romance scams, laundering fraud proceeds, and attending gyration ceremonies. The compartmentalization allows members to maintain separate identities and to avoid cognitive dissonance about their criminal activities. They view the fraud as a form of wealth redistribution, taking from wealthy Americans who they believe benefited from colonialism and slavery, while viewing their legitimate businesses as proof of their entrepreneurial capability and integration into American society. The initiation process is the mechanism through which the Black Axe creates the loyalty required to sustain its operations. Recruitment often targets first-year university students, who are told the campus is a hostile environment where they need protection. Older members identify vulnerable students during orientation events, social gatherings, and through observation of campus social dynamics. They look for students who are isolated, who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, or who demonstrate ambition without obvious means of achieving their goals. The initial approach is friendly and non-threatening. Older members invite the target to parties, offer assistance with academic work, and include them in social activities. This cultivation period can last weeks or months, during which the target becomes increasingly dependent on the social network provided by the group. If a student shows hesitation after learning about the organization's true nature, the group uses misinformation, psychological pressure, or physical threats to force participation. Hesitant targets are told that refusing initiation will result in them being targeted by rival groups who will view them as potential recruits for the Black Axe and therefore threats. They are warned that the organization has power to affect their academic performance, their job prospects after graduation, and even their physical safety. In some cases, physical intimidation is used, with groups of members confronting the target and making clear that refusal is not an option. The forced recruitment creates a category of members who join out of fear rather than genuine commitment, but the initiation process is designed to transform even reluctant recruits into loyal members. Once a recruit agrees, the initiation begins. The process is referred to as blending or bamming, and it is designed to degrade the individual's sense of self and replace it with identification as an axeman. The ceremony typically occurs at night in a secluded location, often in forested areas near campus or in abandoned buildings where participants will not be disturbed. The recruit is brought to the location blindfolded and disoriented, unsure of what will happen. Upon arrival, the blindfold is removed, and the recruit finds himself surrounded by dozens of members wearing black clothing and sometimes masks. The atmosphere is deliberately frightening, with drums playing, members chanting in Yoruba or other Nigerian languages, and candles or torches providing the only light. Recruits are stripped naked and forced to lie in mud, while older members subject them to severe physical abuse. They are flogged with canes, kicked, and verbally humiliated. The physical abuse serves multiple purposes. It demonstrates the power the organization holds over the recruit, it creates a shared traumatic experience that bonds initiates to each other, and it establishes that the organization demands absolute obedience. The abuse is not random but follows a ritual script that has been refined over decades. Each blow, each humiliation has symbolic meaning within the organization's belief system. The recruit is told that the suffering is necessary to burn away his old identity and prepare him for rebirth as an Axeman. The ordeal includes the Devil's Passage, in which initiates must crawl through their tormentor's legs, a process meant to signify their rebirth into the Brotherhood. As the recruit crawls, members strike him and force him to repeat phrases affirming his loyalty to the organization and his rejection of his previous identity. The passage ends when the recruit reaches the priest, who is positioned at the end of the human tunnel. The priest helps the recruit to his feet and embraces him, marking the transition from torment to acceptance. This sudden shift from violence to acceptance creates powerful psychological conditioning, as the recruit associates relief and safety with submission to the organization. After enduring hours of physical punishment, the recruit is brought before the priest, who administers the blood oath. The initiate signs a membership scroll with their thumbprint, often using their own blood or ink mixed with blood. The scroll contains the names of all members of the chapter, creating a document that binds everyone together in mutual culpability. They swear an oath of absolute secrecy and loyalty to the organization. The oath includes specific pledges never to reveal the organization's activities to outsiders, never to testify against fellow members, and never to attempt to leave the organization. Members are told that once they are initiated, they have just acquired their coffin, reinforcing the idea that the only way out is death. The blood oath incorporates elements of juju and traditional African spiritual beliefs. The priest invokes ancestral spirits and deities, calling upon them to witness the oath and to punish anyone who breaks it. Initiates are told that violating the oath will result in spiritual consequences, including madness, disease, and death. For members who hold traditional beliefs, this spiritual dimension creates a powerful deterrent against defection. Even members who are skeptical of the spiritual claims find that the psychological impact of the ceremony creates lasting anxiety about the consequences of betrayal. The combination of physical trauma, psychological manipulation, and spiritual intimidation produces a level of control that persists for years or even decades after the initiation. Upon completing the initiation, the recruit is given a strong name based on a famous African freedom fighter or revolutionary leader. These names become the primary identifiers used in internal communication. Examples include Nelson Mandela, Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, Marcus Garvey, Thomas Sankara, and Amilcar Cabral. The practice serves multiple purposes. It connects the initiate to the group's Pan-Africanist ideology, creating a sense of historical continuity and purpose. It creates a new identity that replaces the recruit's civilian identity, reinforcing the psychological transformation accomplished by the initiation. It provides operational security by obscuring real identities, making it difficult for law enforcement to track members. In the diaspora, these names appear on bank accounts, business registrations, and encrypted communications, making it difficult for investigators to establish the true identity of suspects. A single individual might operate under his legal name in civilian life, his strong name within the organization, and one or more aliases in his criminal activities. The layering of identities creates confusion for investigators and provides deniability if criminal activities are discovered. The strong names also serve as a form of psychological warfare against law enforcement and the public. By appropriating the names of respected historical figures, the organization attempts to cloak its criminal activities in the legitimacy of anti-colonial struggle. The psychological impact of the initiation creates what the organization describes as bondage. Members fear spiritual consequences if they betray the group, as the rituals incorporate elements of juju and traditional African beliefs. This fear is reinforced through social gatherings called gyrations, which feature edged drums, music, and cultural performances. These events serve as both celebrations and reminders of the group's codes. Attendance is mandatory for members, and failure to participate can result in punishment ranging from fines to physical violence. The gyrations recreate elements of the initiation ceremony, including music, dancing, and ritualistic performances, keeping the traumatic bonding experience fresh in members' minds. The combination of physical violence, spiritual manipulation, and cultural ritual produces a level of loyalty that persists even after members emigrate and establish lives in foreign countries. Members who have lived in the United States or Europe for decades, who have families and legitimate careers, still attend gyrations and fulfill obligations to the organization. The initiation creates a permanent psychological mark that shapes identity and behavior long after the physical wounds have healed. This durability of the bonding mechanism is what makes the Black Axe so difficult to combat through traditional law enforcement methods. Arrests and prosecutions remove individual members, but they do not break the psychological conditioning that creates loyalty in the first place. By the 2010s, the Black Axe had established operational zones across Africa, Europe, and North America. One of the most significant was the Cape Town zone, based in South Africa. Cape Town emerged as a primary hub for internet fraud targeting victims in the United States. The city's advantages included a large Nigerian diaspora community, relatively weak law enforcement attention to financial crimes targeting foreign victims, good telecommunications infrastructure, and geographic distance from Nigeria that provided operational security. The zone was founded by Perry Osajid, who took the strong name Lord Sultan Abubakar I. Osajid served as the primary zonal head, overseeing a network of members who specialized in romance scams, business email compromise schemes, and money laundering. Osajid was a sophisticated operator who understood both the technical and social engineering aspects of internet fraud. He had operated scams in Nigeria before relocating to South Africa, where he recognized the opportunity to scale operations by recruiting from the local diaspora community. Under his leadership, the Cape Town zone developed standardized procedures for conducting fraud schemes, training materials for new members, and systems for moving money that minimized the risk of detection. Osajid maintained regular communication with the National Council in Nigeria, reporting on the zone's activities and seeking approval for major initiatives. He also coordinated with other zones in Europe and North America, sharing successful tactics and sometimes collaborating on large-scale schemes that required resources beyond what a single zone could provide. Other leaders within the Cape Town zone included Ignorance Isbiji, known as Lord Samuel S. Nujoma, who served as a co-zonal head and became a primary target for U.S. extradition. Isbiji specialized in business email compromise schemes, which required more technical sophistication than romance scams. He recruited members with computer skills and provided them with training on how to identify vulnerable business email systems, how to intercept and monitor communications, and how to craft convincing fraudulent messages. Isbiji maintained detailed records of successful schemes, analyzing what tactics worked best and refining the zone's procedures based on this analysis. His meticulous approach made him valuable to the organization, but also created evidence that would later be used against him in court. Franklin Edosa Osajid operated under the name Lord Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, using the full name of the South African liberation leader to mask fraudulent activities. The choice of Nelson Mandela as a strong name was particularly audacious given that Mandela had died in 2013 and remained deeply revered in South Africa. Franklin Osajid used the name on bank accounts and business registrations, betting that South African authorities would be reluctant to investigate someone using Mandela's name due to the political sensitivity. The tactic was partially successful, as several fraudulent accounts operated for months before being flagged. Franklin specialized in recruiting money mules, individuals who would open bank accounts in their own names and then transfer funds on behalf of the organization in exchange for a percentage of each transaction. Tony Iyamu, known as Lord Aminukano, managed widespread internet fraud operations. Iyamu was responsible for coordinating multiple simultaneous schemes, ensuring that the zone's members were productively engaged and that money was flowing consistently. He maintained spreadsheets tracking active scams, including victim information, amounts paid to date, and predicted total yields. This data-driven approach allowed him to identify which types of scams were most profitable and to allocate resources accordingly. Iyamu also managed the zone's relationship with facilitators in the United States, including the business owners who served as laundering points and the money mules who received victim funds. These individuals coordinated their activities through encrypted communications, primarily using WhatsApp to discuss fraud schemes, victim targeting, and money movement. The use of WhatsApp provided a degree of operational security, as messages were encrypted end-to-end and the platform was widely used for legitimate communications, making it difficult for law enforcement to justify monitoring without specific probable cause. However, the conspirators often communicated with surprising openness, discussing criminal activities in language that was only thinly coded. They shared screenshots of victim messages, celebrated successful scams, and complained about law enforcement pressure. This openness reflected a belief that they were safe from prosecution as long as they remained in South Africa and avoided traveling to countries with extradition treaties with the United States. The Cape Town zone operated with significant autonomy from the organization's Nigerian headquarters, but it maintained the same hierarchical structure and ritualistic practices. Members held gyrations to reinforce loyalty and celebrate successful operations. These gatherings occurred monthly or more frequently during periods of high activity. They served as opportunities to distribute proceeds from scams, with leaders receiving their percentages and successful members being recognized publicly. The gyrations also served as recruitment events, as prospective members were invited to observe the camaraderie and success of the organization without being exposed to the criminal activities. New recruits saw members celebrating with expensive clothes, jewelry, and vehicles, creating the impression that membership brought wealth and status. They recruited new members from the Nigerian diaspora in South Africa, targeting young men who felt marginalized or were seeking community. South Africa's complex racial dynamics and economic inequality created conditions where young Nigerian immigrants often faced discrimination and limited economic opportunities. The Black Axe positioned itself as a solution to these challenges, offering protection, community, and a path to financial success. Recruiters identified targets at Nigerian community events, at churches, and through social media. They emphasized the organization's Pan-Africanist ideology and its role as a brotherhood that supported its members. Only after recruitment was well advanced did targets learn about the criminal activities that were expected of members. The zone's success attracted attention from international law enforcement, but its location outside Nigeria provided a degree of protection from domestic pressure. South African authorities were slower to recognize the threat posed by the group, viewing it initially as a Nigerian community organization rather than a criminal enterprise. This perception was reinforced by the Black Axe's public-facing activities, which included cultural events, charity work, and community organizing that portrayed the organization positively. By the time South African authorities understood the scale of criminal activity being conducted by the Cape Town zone, the organization had already established deep roots within the Nigerian diaspora community and had created substantial infrastructure for its operations. The Cape Town zone specialized in two primary fraud schemes: romance scams and business email compromise. Romance scams targeted vulnerable individuals in the United States, particularly the elderly, divorced, and widowed. The targeting was deliberate and based on analysis of which demographic groups were most vulnerable to social engineering. Older individuals were considered ideal targets because they often had substantial savings or retirement accounts, because they had grown up before internet fraud became widespread and lacked sophisticated detection skills, and because they were often isolated and seeking companionship. Recently divorced or widowed individuals were particularly vulnerable because they were experiencing emotional trauma and were eager to form new relationships. Members created fake profiles on dating sites like Match.com and Christian Mingle, using stolen photographs and fabricated identities. The photographs were carefully selected to appear attractive but not suspiciously so. They typically showed middle-aged professionals in casual settings, creating an impression of stability and normalcy. The stolen photographs came from various sources, including social media profiles of people in other countries, stock photography websites, and in some cases, photographs of members' friends or relatives who were not involved in the schemes. The identities were crafted to match the photographs and to appeal to American cultural expectations. Common personas included military personnel stationed overseas, engineers working on international projects, and businessmen engaged in overseas ventures. They assumed the strong names assigned during initiation or created entirely new personas. The use of strong names on dating profiles served dual purposes. It maintained operational security within the organization by ensuring that all members used their assigned names consistently, and it created a barrier between the member's real identity and his criminal persona. Once contact was established, the scammer would spend weeks or months building trust with the victim, using scripted conversations designed to create emotional attachment. The scripts were refined over years of operation, incorporating psychological principles of social engineering and manipulation. The initial messages were friendly but not overly aggressive. Scammers would comment on details from the victim's profile, asking questions about hobbies, family, or interests. They would share fabricated details about their own lives, creating a sense of reciprocity. As the conversation progressed, they would introduce elements of vulnerability, sharing fictional problems or challenges that created opportunities for the victim to provide support. This vulnerable positioning was strategic, as it activated the victim's caretaking instincts and created a sense that the victim was important and needed. The scammer would express gratitude for the victim's kindness, reinforcing the behavior and encouraging continued engagement. The conversations followed predictable patterns designed to escalate emotional investment. After establishing basic rapport, scammers would move to expressions of affection, often earlier in the relationship than would be typical in legitimate courtships. They would use romantic language, send poems or song lyrics, and make promises about future meetings and life together. The rapid escalation served to overwhelm the victim's skepticism and to create a sense of urgency. Victims who might have been cautious about professing love after a few weeks of messaging found themselves caught up in the intensity of the interaction and reciprocating the expressions of affection. After establishing trust, the scammer introduced a fabricated crisis. Common narratives included claims of working on a construction project in South Africa and needing money for equipment repairs, legal fees, or problems with a crane. The construction narrative was particularly effective because it explained why the persona was overseas and unable to meet the victim in person, why he had irregular access to communications, and why he might suddenly need substantial sums of money for unexpected expenses. Other scenarios involved inheritances that required tax payments before funds could be released, medical emergencies for fictional relatives who needed expensive treatments, or business opportunities that needed initial capital and promised substantial returns. Victims were instructed to wire money to specific bank accounts, often located in the United States but controlled by the Black Axe network. The use of domestic accounts was crucial to the scheme's success. Victims were reassured by the fact that they were sending money within the United States rather than to a foreign account, which would have raised more suspicion. The accounts belonged to money mules, business fronts, or shell companies that appeared legitimate. Victims were given plausible explanations for why the money had to be sent to a third party rather than directly to the person they believed they were helping. Common explanations included that the persona's accounts were frozen due to being overseas, that the money needed to go to a vendor or service provider directly, or that tax or legal complications required payment to a specific entity. If a victim hesitated or questioned the legitimacy of the request, the scammer escalated to threats. This tactic, known as sextortion, involved threatening to distribute personally sensitive photographs or information to the victim's family and friends unless payment was made. The transition from romance to extortion was jarring for victims, many of whom had believed they were in genuine relationships. The threats were specific and credible. Scammers would reference the victim's family members by name, having gathered information from social media or earlier conversations. They would threaten to send explicit photographs that the victim had shared during the relationship to the victim's children, employers, or church communities. The shame and fear created by these threats often compelled victims to pay even when they had begun to suspect the relationship was fraudulent. Business email compromise schemes operated on a larger scale and targeted companies rather than individuals. Members of the Cape Town zone intercepted business emails through phishing attacks or by compromising email accounts directly. Phishing attacks involve sending emails that appeared to come from legitimate sources, such as IT departments or business partners, requesting that employees verify their credentials or click on links that installed malware. Once credentials were obtained or malware was installed, the attackers gained access to the company's email system. They could read incoming and outgoing messages, search through archived communications, and send emails that appeared to come from legitimate accounts. Once inside a company's email system, they monitored correspondence to identify upcoming payments or invoices. The monitoring period could last weeks or months as the attackers sought to understand the company's payment procedures, identify key personnel, and wait for high-value transactions. They paid particular attention to communications with overseas vendors or partners, as these transactions often involved larger amounts and had more complex verification procedures that could be exploited. They also identified periods when key personnel would be unavailable, such as vacations or business trips, as these created opportunities to send fraudulent messages without immediate detection. At the critical moment, they sent fraudulent emails from accounts that appeared legitimate, instructing the company to redirect payments to accounts controlled by the Black Axe. The emails mimicked the language and formatting of legitimate business correspondence, making detection difficult. They included details gathered from monitoring previous communications, such as reference numbers, project names, and specific transaction details that created an impression of authenticity. In some cases, the scammers impersonated executives or vendors, creating a sense of urgency that discouraged verification. Messages might claim that payment details had changed due to banking issues, that urgent payment was required to avoid project delays, or that updated wire instructions reflected new security procedures. The scale of these operations was substantial. In the Texas case alone, investigators estimated global losses at over $17 million linked to Black Axe schemes. Individual victims lost hundreds of thousands of dollars, with some elderly victims losing their entire retirement savings. The financial losses created cascading problems for victims, including inability to pay for housing or medical care, forced returns to the workforce after retirement, and in some cases bankruptcy. The emotional impact on victims was severe, as many felt deep shame and embarrassment at having been deceived. Victims often delayed reporting the fraud because they were embarrassed to admit they had been fooled, because they continued to hope the relationship was genuine, or because they feared judgment from family and friends. The emotional impact extended beyond the financial loss. Many romance scam victims reported experiencing depression, anxiety, and symptoms of post-traumatic stress following the discovery that the relationship was fraudulent. The betrayal of trust, combined with the manipulation and exploitation, created psychological wounds that persisted long after the financial aspects were addressed. Victims questioned their judgment and their ability to trust others, leading to social isolation and reluctance to form new relationships. Some victims required psychological counseling to process the experience and to recover their sense of self-worth. The financial impact extended beyond individual losses. Companies targeted by business email compromise schemes faced not only direct financial losses, but also reputational damage and increased insurance costs. Businesses that fell victim to BEC scams found that their insurance premiums increased substantially when they sought to renew their cyber insurance policies. They faced questions from partners and clients about their security procedures. In some cases, companies lost contracts or business relationships because partners lost confidence in their ability to protect sensitive financial information. The cumulative effect of these schemes across thousands of victims and hundreds of companies represented a significant drain on the American economy, estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars annually. The movement of stolen money required infrastructure within the United States. The Black Axe addressed this need through its business front strategy, which involved establishing legitimate legal entities to provide cover for the transfer of illicit funds. Evidence recovered from the cloud storage of Sandra Iribhag, a co-defendant in the Texas case, revealed explicit instructions on how members should operate. The digital evidence included training documents, communication logs, and financial spreadsheets that provided a comprehensive picture of how the organization approached the business front problem. The documents showed sophisticated understanding of U.S. business law, banking regulations, and anti-money laundering procedures. The organization directed members to register businesses even if their primary income came from fraud. The instructions were specific and detailed. Members were told what types of businesses were most suitable for laundering purposes, how to register with state authorities, how to open business bank accounts, and how to maintain the appearance of legitimacy through basic record-keeping and tax filings. The preferred business types were those that involved high transaction volumes, that dealt with services rather than physical products, and that had plausible reasons for receiving payments from individuals rather than corporations. Medical services, consulting firms, trading companies, and technology services were all recommended because they fit these criteria. These businesses served multiple purposes. They provided a veneer of legitimacy, created a pathway for money to enter the U.S. financial system, and made it difficult for authorities to distinguish between legitimate transactions and criminal proceeds. The businesses maintained professional websites, had business phone numbers, and in some cases even had physical office locations, though these were often virtual offices or shared workspace arrangements. The level of detail in creating the legitimate appearance was substantial. Businesses registered with professional associations, obtained business licenses and permits where required, and even engaged in limited legitimate activity to create transaction history that would make fraud proceeds less conspicuous. One of the most significant business fronts identified by investigators was Ortho Neuro Imaging, a medical imaging company in Texas. The company was owned by Chigozie Equinugo, a high-ranking member of the Black Axe who used his legitimate business to funnel victim money. Ortho Neuro Imaging was a functional business that actually provided medical imaging services to patients and healthcare providers. This legitimate activity created cover for the fraudulent transactions. Ortho Neuro Imaging received over $300,000 from fraud victims during the period investigated by federal authorities. The funds entered the business account as payments for non-existent services or through other fabricated justifications. The accounting for these fraudulent deposits was sophisticated. Equinugo created false invoices and documentation suggesting that the payments were for medical imaging services provided to patients. In some cases, he used the identities of real patients who had received services, adding fraudulent charges to their accounts that were never actually billed to insurance or to the patients themselves. In other cases, he created entirely fictional patient records, complete with fake diagnoses and imaging results to justify the payments. The false documentation would survive casual scrutiny from bank compliance officers, but would not withstand detailed forensic examination. Once in the account, the money was layered through multiple transactions to obscure its origin. Equinugo transferred funds between his business account and personal accounts, paid fictitious expenses to other Black Axe-controlled entities, and made wire transfers to accounts overseas. The transactions were structured to appear like normal business operations. Payments were described as equipment purchases, professional services, vendor payments, or other ordinary business expenses. The amounts were varied to avoid obvious patterns. Some transactions were very small, under $1,000, while others were substantial, tens of thousands of dollars. The variation made automated detection more difficult. Equinugo then wired portions of the funds to international destinations, primarily in China or Nigeria, completing the laundering process. The international transfers were described as payments for equipment, supplies, or consulting services. Equinugo created documentation supporting these explanations, including purchase orders, invoices from purported suppliers, and shipping documents. Much of this documentation was fabricated, but it provided justification for the transfers that satisfied bank compliance procedures. The use of China as an intermediary destination was strategic, as Chinese financial regulations made it difficult for U.S. authorities to trace the funds further or to recover them once they left the U.S. banking system. Another entity used in the laundering operation was a Brotherhood trading company, operated by Andrew Suarez. Beginning in August 2017, Suarez laundered money for the Cape Town zone by receiving fraud proceeds into his business account and then transferring them to accounts controlled by zone leaders. Suarez was not a full member of the Black Axe but operated as a facilitator, earning a percentage of each transaction. His involvement demonstrated the organization's ability to recruit non-members who were willing to participate in the scheme for financial gain. Suarez represented a category of facilitators who were aware they were involved in criminal activity but who rationalized their participation by focusing on the financial benefits and by maintaining psychological distance from the actual fraud victims. Suarez received detailed instructions on how to handle the money. He was told what descriptions to use for incoming deposits, how long to hold funds before transferring them onward, and what explanations to provide if questioned by bank compliance officers. He maintained logs of all transactions and reported regularly to his Black Axe contacts. The organization paid him between 5% and 10% of each transaction he processed, providing substantial income for what appeared to be simple money transfers. Suarez was eventually arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison for his role in the money laundering conspiracy. His prosecution sent a message to other potential facilitators that they would be held accountable even if they were not full members of the organization. The procedural flow of a typical Black Axe financial crime involved several stages designed to evade detection. The sophistication of the money flow reflected years of refinement based on trial and error, analysis of which techniques worked and which triggered bank alerts, and adaptation to changing bank security procedures. First, victim money entered a domestic account, often one belonging to a business front or a money mule. The initial deposit appeared legitimate, as it came from a U.S. bank and was categorized as payment for goods or services. Victims initiated the transfers themselves through their own bank accounts, believing they were paying for legitimate services or helping someone they cared about. The receiving accounts were carefully selected to avoid suspicion. Money mule accounts belonged to individuals with clean credit histories, no criminal records, and existing banking relationships that dated back months or years. Business front accounts belonged to entities that had been operating long enough to establish transaction patterns, that had legitimate income streams mixed with the fraudulent deposits, and that maintained proper documentation and tax filings. The deposits were described using language that matched the purported purpose of the account. Medical businesses received patient payments, trading companies received product purchases, consulting firms received service fees. Second, the money was layered through multiple transfers between different accounts, each transaction obscuring the source of the funds. The layering process was the most critical phase for avoiding detection. Funds rarely moved directly from the initial receiving account to an international destination. Instead, they were transferred through a series of domestic accounts, each transfer adding another layer of separation between the victim and the final destination. A typical layering sequence might involve 5 to 10 transfers. Victim funds entered a money mule account, were transferred to a business front account, were divided and sent to multiple shell company accounts, were aggregated in another business account, and were finally wired overseas. This layering process often involved moving money between businesses in different states, creating a complex web that automated detection systems struggled to flag. The interstate transfers were advantageous because they made investigation more complicated, requiring coordination between law enforcement agencies in multiple jurisdictions. They also created banking chain complications, as funds moved through regional banks, national banks, and online financial services providers, each with different reporting requirements and compliance procedures. The diversity of financial institutions involved made it difficult for any single institution to identify the full scope of suspicious activity, as each saw only a small portion of the total money flow. The transfers were described using business language that appeared legitimate. Payments between accounts were labeled as vendor payments, subcontractor fees, loan repayments, investment distributions, or other ordinary business transactions. The Black Axe maintained templates for documentation that could be generated to support these explanations if questioned. Purchase orders, invoices, contracts, and other business documents were created with enough detail to satisfy casual review, but not enough to survive forensic analysis. The documentation used business language and formatting copied from legitimate documents, making it difficult to identify as fraudulent without detailed examination. Third, the funds were wired to international destinations, typically in China or Nigeria. The use of China as an intermediary was strategic, as it exploited the lack of a unified global financial regulator and the difficulty of obtaining cooperation from Chinese authorities. China has substantial anti-money laundering regulations, but enforcement is inconsistent and international cooperation is limited. Chinese banks are more focused on preventing money leaving China than on scrutinizing money entering the country, particularly when it comes through what appear to be legitimate business transactions. The Black Axe exploited this asymmetry by routing funds through Chinese banks before moving them to Nigeria or keeping them in China for purchases. The process repeated multiple times for each fraud victim, with small amounts moved incrementally to avoid triggering bank alerts for suspicious activity. Rather than transferring the entire amount stolen from a victim in a single transaction, the money was broken into smaller pieces and moved over days or weeks. A victim who lost $100,000 might see that money divided into 10 $10,000 transfers, each following its own path through the layering system. The division made detection significantly more difficult, as each individual transfer appeared smaller and less suspicious than the aggregate amount. The Black Axe understood the thresholds used by financial institutions to flag transactions, and they structured their operations to remain just below those thresholds. U.S. banks are required to report cash transactions over $10,000 and to file suspicious activity reports for transactions that appear unusual or suspicious. The Black Axe studied these requirements and designed its procedures to avoid triggering them. Transfers were kept below $10,000 when possible, or if larger transfers were necessary, they were justified with documentation and structured to appear as normal business activity. The organization maintained detailed knowledge of bank security procedures and updated its tactics as banks improved their detection capabilities. When larger amounts needed to be moved, they were broken into smaller transfers spread across multiple accounts and multiple days. This technique, known as structuring, is illegal under U.S. anti-money laundering laws, but it is difficult to detect in real time without sophisticated monitoring systems and human oversight. Automated systems flag structured transactions based on patterns, such as multiple transactions just under $10,000 occurring within a short time period. The Black Axe countered this by varying the amounts randomly, spacing transactions irregularly, and using different combinations of accounts for each sequence. The human judgment required to identify these patterns overwhelmed bank compliance departments, which were dealing with millions of transactions daily. Investigators discovered that the organization maintained detailed records of money movements, victim information, and payments to various members and associates. The record-keeping was surprisingly thorough given the criminal nature of the activity. Members maintained spreadsheets tracking active scams, including victim names, amounts paid to date, and predicted total yields. They tracked accounts used for layering, noting which accounts were working well and which had been flagged or closed. They maintained logs of international transfers, including amounts, dates, descriptions used, and fees charged. This documentation was essential for the organization's operations, allowing leaders to track performance, allocate proceeds fairly, and identify problems before they resulted in arrests. A spreadsheet found on a computer belonging to one of the conspirators listed initials corresponding to individuals who had received payments from the fraud proceeds. The spreadsheet was structured like a corporate accounting document, with columns for names, dates, amounts, and purposes. One entry showed AM, which investigators believe stood for Ace Magashule, a South African politician, though this connection remained unproven in the U.S. case and represented one of the more speculative elements of the investigation. Another entry showed TM, thought to be Tim Mukisi, a former head of the Department of Human Settlements in South Africa who had been linked to property payments in other corruption cases. The spreadsheet also listed payments for specific expenses that revealed the extent to which the Black Axe functioned as more than just a criminal organization. It operated as a shadow financial network that funded political activities, personal luxuries, and investments for members and associates. The payments included 250,000 rand for flights to Cuba for 19 delegates attending a political course, suggesting links between the organization and political movements. The political education trips to Cuba were consistent with the Black Axe's Pan-Africanist ideology and suggested the organization was investing in developing political sophistication among its leadership. Another payment was 55,000 rand for school fees for a judge's daughter studying in the USA. This payment was particularly revealing, as it suggested the organization was making payments to judicial officials, presumably to secure favorable treatment in legal proceedings. The payment created leverage over the judge, who would be compromised by accepting funds that came from criminal activity, even if those funds were ostensibly for his daughter's education. The strategic use of payments to create compromised officials was a sophisticated corruption technique more commonly associated with traditional organized crime than with fraud-focused groups. Another payment was 650,000 rand as a deposit for a Maserati luxury vehicle. The purchase of high-end vehicles served multiple purposes for the organization. It demonstrated success and status, reinforcing recruitment messages about the financial benefits of membership. It provided a form of liquid asset that could be sold if cash was needed. It served as a reward for successful members, creating incentive for continued performance. The specific choice of a Maserati, an Italian luxury brand, reflected aspirational consumption patterns among the organization's leadership. Yet another payment was 600,000 rand for a property investment. The property investments revealed the organization's interest in converting fraud proceeds into legitimate assets that could generate long-term returns. Real estate provided opportunities to launder large amounts of money through property purchases, to generate legitimate rental income, and to build wealth that could support members and their families. The organization encouraged members to invest proceeds in property, viewing it as a way to establish economic foundations in foreign countries. In September 2021, a federal grand jury in the northern and eastern districts of Texas indicted 35 defendants in 5 related Black Axe criminal cases. The indictments represented the culmination of years of investigation by the FBI, IRS, and other federal agencies. The investigation had begun in 2018 with reports from victims who had lost substantial sums to romance scams. Initial investigations treated the cases as isolated incidents, but as investigators dug deeper, they began to identify connections between different victims' experiences. Multiple victims had sent money to the same accounts. Different scams used similar language and tactics. The money flow patterns suggested coordination rather than independent criminal activity. The charges included conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and aggravated identity theft. The wire fraud charges carried maximum sentences of 20 years in prison. The money laundering charges carried maximum sentences of 20 years. The aggravated identity theft charges carried mandatory consecutive sentences of 2 years. If convicted on all counts, defendants faced potential sentences of 40 years or more. The severity of the charges reflected both the scale of the fraud and the government's determination to send a message that these crimes would be prosecuted aggressively. The scale of the indictments sent a clear message that U.S. authorities were treating the Black Axe as a priority transnational organized crime threat. The designation as a priority threat came from the highest levels of the Department of Justice and reflected recognition that the Black Axe represented a new type of criminal organization that required a coordinated federal response. The priority designation meant that U.S. attorneys' offices would allocate resources to Black Axe cases, that investigative agencies would share information about Black Axe activity, and that diplomatic channels would be used to seek cooperation from foreign governments in disrupting the organization's operations. The Texas cases provided granular detail on how the organization operated within the United States. The indictments included narrative descriptions of specific fraud schemes, transaction flow charts showing how money moved through the system, and evidence demonstrating coordination among the defendants. Investigators traced the flow of money from victim accounts through business fronts and shell companies to international destinations. The money flow analysis required months of work by financial analysts who reviewed hundreds of thousands of transactions, identified patterns, and connected accounts that appeared unrelated on the surface. They recovered electronic communications showing that conspirators openly discussed fraud schemes amongst themselves, often using encrypted messaging apps to coordinate their activities. The communications were recovered through a combination of search warrants, cooperation from platform providers, and in some cases from devices seized from defendants. The volume of communications was substantial, including thousands of messages exchanged among the conspirators over several years. Analysts had to review these messages to identify those that demonstrated criminal activity and that could be used as evidence in prosecution. The communications revealed the casual nature with which members approached their criminal operations, treating fraud as routine business rather than serious crime. Members shared victim information, discussing which victims were paying well and which had become suspicious. They discussed strategies for maximizing payouts, including when to introduce crisis narratives and how much money to request at each stage. They celebrated successful scams, congratulating each other when large payments came through and sharing tactics that had worked well. The casual tone of these discussions was striking, with members using emojis, jokes, and friendly banter while discussing activity that was destroying victims' financial security and emotional well-being. The evidence also included financial records from the 700-plus bank accounts identified by the FBI. These records showed the corpus delicti of the crime, the physical movement of stolen funds through the financial system. The records included deposit slips, wire transfer confirmations, account statements, and internal bank records documenting the transactions. Prosecutors used these records to demonstrate the layering process and to connect individual defendants to specific transactions. The financial evidence was presented through expert testimony from FBI financial analysts who explained how the money flow worked and how they had traced it across multiple accounts and institutions. The records also revealed the scale of the operation, with millions of dollars moving through the accounts over the investigation period. The Texas indictments highlighted several key members of the organization, including those who operated business fronts and those who coordinated the fraud schemes from South Africa. The indictments named both individuals physically present in the United States and those operating from overseas. This included both presented significant challenges, as those in the United States could be arrested immediately, but those overseas required extradition proceedings that could take years. The federal response went beyond criminal charges. Authorities sought asset forfeiture for properties, vehicles, and bank accounts linked to the conspiracy. The asset forfeiture was pursued both as a punishment and as a means of recovering victim losses. Federal law allows seized assets to be distributed to victims in some circumstances, though the process is complex and often results in only partial recovery. The government identified specific assets for forfeiture, including vehicles purchased with fraud proceeds, real estate acquired using laundered money, and the contents of bank accounts that received stolen funds. While the Texas cases focused on romance scams and business email compromise, a parallel investigation led by the U.S. Secret Service in New Jersey targeted the leadership of the Cape Town zone directly. The investigation began with financial intelligence indicating that large sums of money were being moved from the United States to South Africa through suspicious channels. The Secret Service, which has primary jurisdiction over financial crimes including wire fraud and cyber-enabled fraud, began monitoring transactions flowing to South African bank accounts. The monitoring revealed patterns suggesting organized criminal activity rather than isolated incidents. Secret Service agents traced the money to specific individuals in Cape Town who were identified as high-ranking members of the Black Axe. The identification process involved cooperation with South African financial intelligence units, analysis of social media and public records, and intelligence from confidential sources within the Nigerian diaspora community. Agents identified Perry Osajid, Inorance Isbaji, and other leaders of the Cape Town zone as the primary targets. The investigation expanded to include international partners, including South African law enforcement and Interpol. The international cooperation was essential, as the evidence was scattered across multiple countries and successful prosecution required coordinating arrests and evidence seizure simultaneously in multiple jurisdictions. In October 2021, 7 leaders of the Cape Town zone were arrested in South Africa following the Secret Service-led investigation. The arrests were coordinated to occur simultaneously to prevent targets from being warned and fleeing. South African police executed search warrants at the homes and businesses of the targets, seizing computers, phones, documents, and other evidence. The arrests included Perry Osajid, Inorance Isbaji, Franklin Adosa Osajid, and Eg Tony Iyamu. 8 Nigerians were ultimately charged with conspiring to engage in internet scams and money laundering. The charges were filed in the District of New Jersey, where many of the victim funds had originated or passed through during the laundering process. The indictments provided the first detailed public accounting of the Cape Town zone's structure and operations. The charging documents included narrative descriptions of how the zone functioned, organizational charts showing the hierarchy, and specific examples of fraud schemes conducted under the zone's direction. The level of detail was unprecedented for a prosecution targeting African confraternity-related crime, and reflected the years of investigation that had gone into building the case. The indictments made clear that U.S. authorities viewed the Black Axe not as a series of individual fraudsters, but as an organized criminal enterprise operating according to a defined structure and code. The Secret Service investigation relied heavily on digital evidence. Agents recovered encrypted communications showing zone leaders coordinating fraud schemes and directing members to move money through specific accounts. The communications included WhatsApp messages, emails, and in some cases text messages. The content was detailed, with leaders providing specific instructions about how to approach victims, what narratives to use, and how to handle complications. Some messages included training materials for new members, explaining the techniques used in romance scams and business email compromise. The recovered communications provided prosecutors with the evidence needed to prove conspiracy charges, demonstrating that the defendants had agreed to commit crimes and had taken steps to further the conspiracy. They also obtained financial records from South African banks showing large deposits and withdrawals that corresponded with fraud activity in the United States. The financial records showed money arriving in South African accounts shortly after victims in the United States had made wire transfers. The timing correlation was compelling evidence linking the South African accounts to the U.S. fraud schemes. Investigators analyzed thousands of transactions, identifying patterns that demonstrated the systematic nature of the money laundering operation. They tracked money as it moved through South African banks, was withdrawn in cash, was used to purchase goods and property, or was transferred to Nigeria or other countries. The evidence revealed that the Cape Town zone operated with a level of sophistication that required international cooperation to disrupt. The zone had established relationships with corrupt bank employees in South Africa who provided advance warning of investigations or who facilitated account openings despite red flags. They had developed expertise in exploiting differences between U.S. and South African banking regulations. They maintained safe houses where members could meet without attracting attention. The infrastructure they had built over years of operations required a coordinated international response to dismantle. Agents worked with counterparts in South African law enforcement to execute search warrants, seize evidence, and arrest suspects. The coordination between U.S. and South African authorities represented a model for how transnational crime investigations could succeed when agencies shared intelligence and resources. Regular video conferences allowed investigators on both continents to coordinate their activities. U.S. agents traveled to South Africa to assist with searches and to identify evidence that would be most valuable for prosecution. South African investigators traveled to the United States to observe financial analysis techniques and to provide testimony about conditions in Cape Town that contextualized the evidence. The Black Axe's operations extended far beyond the United States and South Africa. By the early 2020s, the organization had established zones in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The European presence was particularly strong in Italy, where the organization had been active since the 1990s. Members operated in Rome, Milan, and other cities, engaging in fraud schemes targeting European victims and in human trafficking operations that brought Nigerian women to Italy for prostitution. The Italian presence had drawn attention from Italian anti-mafia prosecutors, who recognized similarities between the Black Axe's operations and those of traditional Italian organized crime groups. Interpol recognized the group as a significant transnational threat and began coordinating a global response. The recognition came after years of advocacy by law enforcement agencies in Nigeria, South Africa, and Western countries that had been targeted by the organization. Interpol's Trafficking in Human Beings and Smuggling of Migrants Unit and its Financial Crimes Unit collaborated to develop a comprehensive strategy for targeting the Black Axe and related West African organized crime groups. The strategy focused on financial intelligence, recognizing that the money trails provided the most actionable evidence for prosecutions. In 2024, Interpol launched Operation Jackal III, a coordinated enforcement action targeting West African organized crime networks, with the Black Axe as a primary focus. The operation involved law enforcement agencies from 21 countries and resulted in the arrest of nearly 300 suspects. The planning for Operation Jackal III took months and involved extensive intelligence sharing and coordination. Each participating country identified targets within its jurisdiction, shared information about financial flows crossing borders, and prepared operational plans for simultaneous action. Operation Jackal III demonstrated the power of international cooperation. Financial intelligence units from member countries shared information on suspicious transactions, allowing investigators to trace money flows across borders. The intelligence sharing was facilitated by Interpol's I-24/7 Secure Communications Network, which allowed real-time exchange of information between participating agencies. Analysts at Interpol headquarters compiled the intelligence, identifying connections between different national investigations and helping countries understand how their local Black Axe activity fit into the organization's global operations. Private sector partners, including banks and payment processors, provided data on accounts linked to the Black Axe. The private sector cooperation was crucial, as financial institutions possessed transaction data that government agencies could only obtain through legal processes. Several major banks assigned compliance staff to work directly with law enforcement, reviewing accounts flagged as suspicious and providing detailed transaction histories that helped trace money flows. Payment processors identified patterns in how Black Axe-linked accounts operated, sharing this intelligence so that similar patterns could be detected in other accounts. The operation led to the seizure of $3 million in assets, including cash, vehicles, and property. Authorities seized luxury vehicles that had been purchased with fraud proceeds, including Mercedes, BMW, and Maserati automobiles that members had used to display their wealth. They seized properties in Nigeria, South Africa, Europe, and elsewhere that had been acquired using laundered money. They seized bank account contents, frozen in coordinated actions that prevented targets from moving the money before seizures could be executed. The seized assets represented only a fraction of the total proceeds from Black Axe criminal activity, but they sent a message that the organization's wealth was vulnerable to law enforcement action. Authorities also blocked over 720 bank accounts that were being used to launder fraud proceeds. The blocked accounts were identified through analysis of financial intelligence and through information from the accounts already seized. The blocking actions prevented the accounts from being used for further transactions, while legal processes determined whether the funds would be forfeited. The large number of blocked accounts reflected the organization's reliance on maintaining multiple accounts to move money, and the simultaneous blocking action significantly disrupted the organization's ability to conduct its financial operations. In Argentina, investigators seized $1.2 million in supernotes, high-quality counterfeit banknotes linked to the organization. The discovery revealed that the Black Axe had diversified its criminal activities beyond fraud to include counterfeiting. The supernotes were sophisticated counterfeits of US $100 bills, produced using high-quality printing equipment and paper that closely matched genuine currency. The counterfeits were being distributed through Black Axe networks in South America and were being mixed with genuine currency in ways that made detection difficult. The Argentine seizure was particularly significant because it revealed capabilities and connections that investigators had not previously attributed to the Black Axe. One of the key findings from Operation Jackal III was the organization's reliance on money mules. These individuals, often recruited through promises of easy income, opened bank accounts and transferred funds on behalf of the organization in exchange for a percentage of each transaction. The money mule recruitment occurred through multiple channels. Some mules were recruited in person at Nigerian community events or through personal connections. Others were recruited through online advertisements offering work-from-home opportunities. The advertisements portrayed the work as legitimate currency exchange or payment processing, obscuring the criminal nature of the activity. Many money mules were unaware of the full scope of the criminal activity they were facilitating, believing they were simply helping someone transfer money for legitimate reasons. They were told that the money came from business activities, family support, or other plausible sources. They were given scripts to use if questioned by bank employees about the purpose of transactions. The mules received payments for their services, typically 5–10% of the amounts they processed, which provided motivation to continue without asking too many questions about the source of the funds. However, others were knowingly complicit, receiving a percentage of each transaction in exchange for their cooperation. These sophisticated mules understood they were involved in criminal activity but calculated that the financial benefits outweighed the risks. Some sophisticated mules recruited others, building networks of subordinate mules and taking a percentage of their transactions as well. The hierarchical mule networks mirrored the broader organizational structure of the Black Axe, with multiple layers between the leaders directing the operations and the individuals actually handling the money. Throughout the investigations and prosecutions, the Neo-Black movement of Africa maintained that it was distinct from the Black Axe criminal enterprise. The NBM position was articulated through official statements, media interviews with NBM leaders, and legal filings in cases where the NBM sought to protect its reputation. The NBM argued that it was a legally registered non-governmental organization focused on Pan-Africanism, community development, and social justice. According to this position, criminals had usurped the organization's name and symbols, and the NBM was actively working to purge these individuals from its ranks. The NBM pointed to its registration as a non-profit organization in Nigeria and several other countries. Its public programs focused on education and community development, and its statements condemning violence and criminal activity. NBM leaders gave media interviews explaining that the organization had been infiltrated by criminals who were distorting its mission. They claimed that the Black Axe was a separate entity that had stolen the NBM symbols, and that any overlap between membership was the result of deception rather than institutional connection. In January 2024, the NBM published a list of 24 members expelled for their association with the Black Axe. The expulsion list was published on the NBM's website and distributed through Nigerian media outlets. The list included names, membership numbers, and reasons for expulsion. The stated reasons included engaging in criminal activities that bring disrepute to the organization, association with the Black Axe cult, and violation of the Code of Conduct. The publication of the list was intended to demonstrate that the NBM was taking concrete action to distance itself from criminal elements. In July 2024, the organization expelled 27 more members, including 4 former national presidents, in an attempt to distance itself from criminal activity. The second wave of expulsions was even more dramatic than the first, as it included individuals who had held the highest positions within the organization. The expulsion of former national presidents was particularly significant, as these were individuals who had shaped NBM policy and who had represented the organization publicly. Their expulsion suggested that criminal infiltration had reached the highest levels of the organization's leadership. Law enforcement agencies rejected this distinction. Investigating agencies, including the FBI and Canadian immigration authorities, consider the NBM and the Black Acts to be synonymous or identical. The law enforcement position was based on years of investigation and on evidence that suggested the distinction was a legal fiction maintained for deniability. FBI documents explicitly stated that the Neo-Black Movement of Africa and the Black Acts were identical organizations. Canadian immigration documents made similar statements, noting that individuals claiming NBM membership were considered potentially connected to Black Acts criminal activity. They pointed to shared symbols, the axe and chains, and the colors black, white, and yellow. The symbols were not superficially similar but identical in design and use. Both organizations used the same ritualistic items, the same ceremonial procedures, and the same organizational structure. Members moved between the two organizations without any apparent distinction or initiation process, suggesting they viewed them as parts of the same entity rather than as separate organizations. They noted that high-level NBM leaders had been directly implicated in providing guidance for scamming operations. Evidence seized during investigations included communications from individuals holding official NBM positions discussing fraud schemes, approving criminal operations, and receiving proceeds from scams. In some cases, NBM letterhead had been found in locations where fraud operations were being conducted. Documents providing training on fraud techniques had been distributed through NBM communication channels. Leaked documents and long-term investigations suggested that the NBM served as the legitimate veneer for the Black Axe's criminal activities, allowing members to operate openly while maintaining deniability. The dual structure provided significant advantages. Members could claim affiliation with the NBM, a legal organization, when dealing with authorities or the public. They could participate in NBM public events and community programs to build legitimacy and cover. Meanwhile, criminal activities were attributed to the Black Axe, allowing the NBM to deny responsibility. The debate over whether the NBM could exist independently of the Black Axe became known as the synonymity thesis. The question had significant legal and practical implications. If the two organizations were truly distinct, then law enforcement efforts to target the NBM as a criminal entity could be challenged as overreach. Individuals claiming NBM membership could argue they were being persecuted for their cultural and political beliefs rather than for criminal conduct. The NBM could maintain its legal status and its ability to operate openly. If they were the same, then the NBM's claims of legitimacy were a cover for ongoing criminal activity. Law enforcement could target individuals based on NBM membership without needing to prove direct involvement in Black Axe crimes. The NBM's legal status could be revoked and its assets could be subject to seizure. Governments could ban the organization entirely, as some Nigerian states had already done with both names. Evidence on both sides was compelling but inconclusive. The NBM could point to its registered status, its public community programs, and its efforts to expel criminal members. The organization operated schools and scholarships in Nigeria. It held public cultural events that attracted thousands of attendees. It published magazines and maintained websites focused on Pan-African political and cultural issues. These activities appeared genuine and were difficult to reconcile with the image of a purely criminal organization. Law enforcement could point to the direct involvement of NBM leaders in criminal activity, the shared infrastructure, and the fact that members moved seamlessly between the two organizations without apparent distinction. The evidence of leadership involvement was particularly damaging to the NBM's claims of independence. When individuals holding official NBM positions were found to be directing criminal operations, the organizational distinction became difficult to maintain. The infiltration of the United States by the Black Axe represents more than a case study in transnational crime. It demonstrates how organizations founded on legitimate ideological principles can be captured and repurposed for criminal ends when the mechanisms that maintain legitimacy fail. The evolution from a university confraternity at the University of Benin in 1977 to the complex fraud and money laundering operations prosecuted in 2021 occurred through identifiable stages, each building on the previous transformation. The ritualistic foundation that created loyalty for political resistance was repurposed to create loyalty for criminal enterprise. The networks built for student protection became infrastructure for international fraud. The Pan-Africanist rhetoric that justified resistance to colonialism became cover for exploiting vulnerable victims. The Black Axe's success in embedding itself within American diaspora communities exploits multiple vulnerabilities simultaneously. At the individual level, it targets the human need for community and belonging, particularly among immigrants navigating the challenges of establishing themselves in a new country. The organization offers structured community, clear roles, and cultural connection at a time when many young immigrants feel isolated and uncertain. This appeal is powerful and legitimate, which is what makes the subsequent corruption of new members so effective. By the time recruits understand the criminal expectations, they have already been bonded to the organization through initiation trauma and have been implicated in activities that make leaving dangerous. At the institutional level, the Black Axe exploits gaps between national legal systems and the practical difficulties of coordinating international law enforcement. Money can move between countries faster than legal processes can track it. Individuals can commit crimes in one jurisdiction while living in another where extradition is difficult. Evidence gathered in one country may not be admissible in courts in another. These gaps are inherent in a world organized into sovereign nations with different legal systems, and they create opportunities that sophisticated criminal organizations learn to exploit. At the systemic level, the organization exploits the financial system's reliance on trust and its vulnerability to scale. Banks process millions of transactions daily and must balance security against customer convenience. Automated detection systems can identify obvious patterns but struggle with sophisticated layering techniques. Compliance departments are overwhelmed by the volume of suspicious activity reports and must prioritize their limited resources. The Black Axe studied these vulnerabilities and designed its operations specifically to exploit them, structuring transactions to avoid automated detection and overwhelming manual review through volume and complexity. The ritualistic foundation of the Black Axe creates a form of loyalty that traditional criminal organizations achieve through violence or financial incentives alone. The Blood Oath, the strong names derived from liberation heroes, and the cultural framing of membership as continuation of Pan-African struggle produce psychological bonds that persist across borders and generations. Members who have relocated to the United States, established families, built careers, and lived as law-abiding residents for years still return to the organization when called. They still attend gyrations and fulfill obligations. They still maintain the code of silence even when facing prosecution. This bond makes the organization exceptionally difficult to disrupt through conventional law enforcement methods. Arrests remove individual members, but do not break the structure that produces and sustains those members. Prosecutions create deterrence for some, but are viewed by others as proof of the systemic racism and persecution that the organization's rhetoric warns against. Asset seizures disrupt operations temporarily, but do not prevent the organization from rebuilding through new recruitment and new infrastructure. The durability of the psychological conditioning created through initiation means that even members who have been prosecuted and imprisoned often return to the organization after release rather than cooperating with authorities. The challenge posed by the Black Axe extends beyond the financial losses suffered by victims, though those losses are substantial and devastating. Individual victims lose not just money but their sense of safety and their ability to trust others. The psychological trauma of discovering that an intimate relationship was fabricated for exploitation creates wounds that persist for years. Many victims never fully recover financially or emotionally. The aggregate financial impact runs into hundreds of millions of dollars annually, representing a significant drain on the American economy. But the deeper damage is to institutional trust. When businesses can be used as fronts for criminal activity without detection, the integrity of the commercial system is compromised. Legitimate businesses compete against fronts that have criminal funding, and that can undercut prices because profit is not their primary objective. Banks face increased compliance costs and reputational risks. The business community loses confidence that partners and vendors are legitimate. The cost of these trust failures is difficult to quantify, but is real and significant. When individuals can move between countries while maintaining allegiance to criminal organizations, the immigration system's ability to screen for threats is undermined. Immigration decisions are made based on information provided by applicants and on background checks that can only reveal known criminal activity. Members of the Black Axe who have no criminal records, who present themselves as legitimate business people or students, and who have documentation supporting their claimed purposes pass through immigration screening without raising flags. Once in the country, they establish the infrastructure for fraud operations that victimize Americans while maintaining apparent legitimacy in their daily lives. When communities cannot distinguish between legitimate cultural organizations and criminal enterprises, the social fabric of diaspora communities is damaged. Legitimate Nigerian community organizations that provide genuine support and cultural connection are viewed with suspicion because of the Black Axe's actions. Community leaders who attempt to warn young people about the organization face accusations of persecuting African culture. The organization's use of Pan-Africanist rhetoric and appropriation of liberation symbols makes criticism difficult without appearing to attack African identity itself. This confusion allows the organization to operate within communities while making opposition seem illegitimate or hostile to the community itself. The response to this multifaceted challenge requires more than better enforcement, though enforcement is essential. It requires better understanding of how transnational crime adapts to exploit institutional gaps and human vulnerabilities. Law enforcement agencies have made substantial progress in understanding the Black Axe's structure and operations, as demonstrated by the successful prosecutions in Texas and New Jersey and by Operation Jackal III. But each success is followed by adaptation. The organization studies what worked for law enforcement and changes its tactics. New zones emerge to replace those that have been dismantled. New fraud techniques replace those that have been exposed. Prevention efforts must address the conditions that make recruitment successful. Young diaspora members need legitimate community and support structures that provide the belonging and identity that the Black Axe offers without the criminal expectations. Educational institutions need to educate students about recruitment tactics and about the realities of confraternity membership. Community leaders need support to oppose the organization without fear of retaliation. Families need resources to help members who want to leave but fear the consequences. Financial institutions need better tools to detect sophisticated layering techniques and need frameworks for sharing information about threats across institutional boundaries. The voluntary information sharing that occurred during Operation Jackal III proved effective, but depended on specific relationships and circumstances. Systematic information sharing frameworks would make detection more consistent and less dependent on individual initiative. International cooperation needs sustainable structures beyond individual operations. Operation Jackal III demonstrated what could be accomplished through coordinated action, but the coordination required extensive planning and resource commitment that cannot be sustained continuously. Mechanisms for routine intelligence sharing, for coordinating investigations before they reach the operational stage, and for supporting prosecutions across jurisdictions would make international cooperation more effective. The infiltration of the United States by the Black Axe will not be resolved through any single intervention. The organization's resilience comes from its decentralized structure, its ritualistic bonding mechanisms, its ideological framing, and its sophisticated understanding of the systems it exploits. Addressing the threat requires sustained effort across multiple domains: law enforcement to arrest and prosecute members, intelligence to understand evolving tactics, prevention to reduce recruitment, financial system security to detect money laundering, international cooperation to coordinate across borders, and community engagement to provide alternatives to the organization's appeal.